Hi there, I'm Dr. Matthew Cagle here at Fort Ticonderoga.
And I'm TJ Mullen.
And we've got some artifacts that are going into our Revolutionary Anthology exhibit this year for a case on declaring independence.
Yeah. So the most obvious one here is we have a newspaper. It says the Boston Gazette and Country Journal, printed in Watertown, which is just outside of Boston, I believe, on Monday, July 22nd, 1776. And I can see the first line here is, in Congress, July 4th, 1776, a declaration.
Yeah, almost the entire front page of this newspaper is the text of the Declaration of Independence, which wasn't exactly called the Declaration of Independence at the time. And you do point out, which is interesting, that this is the Boston Gazette, yet it is printed in Watertown, in part because the printer for this newspaper left Boston with the British occupation and started printing in the countryside, and he continued to do so for a number of years. This was printed while they were still in Watertown, and it is July 22nd on a Monday, which was the day that this newspaper released one of their issues. Massachusetts had gotten the news and they had gotten the text of the Declaration before this. This just happened to be when the next edition of his paper was coming out, and so that's when it got printed. It is the first printing, though, of the Declaration of Independence in the Boston Gazette and Country Journal, which is pretty interesting. That delay in time, though, also means that, of course, in the interior, we get additional information about the reception of the Declaration.
Yeah. And this is the way that most people in America would have first heard about the Declaration, correct?
Yeah, there were printers that were printing broadsides. Of course, Congress was supporting the printing of this, which was circulating around the country. But this is much more mass media. This is something that people are going to be circulating. A lot of newspapers were read aloud to people, especially people that were illiterate, and they would have heard it by reading. And the Declaration of Independence is a document that is meant to be read. And so this is a way that it was being read in that way. We even have some information that officers in the Continental Army are sharing the Declaration as well as other information through newspapers like this.
Yeah. So I've read through this entire newspaper, and it's a really fascinating cross-section of life during this time. You can read the whole thing, check it out on our online database. We have PDFs online that you can scan through the whole thing. But there's some really fascinating things going on, and some things that are kind of contradictory to what we might think the attitude of America was at that time. Right here, just below the end of the Declaration of Independence, you can see John Hancock's signature right there. And right here, under the title "Stop Deserter," is an advertisement for soldiers who have deserted the Continental Army, and the officers are asking them to be returned to the Army.
Yes, and that's not even the only one in this particular volume. It just happens to be on the front page right with the Declaration.
In fact, there are 12 soldiers just in this one edition of the newspaper asking to be returned to the Army.
Yeah, so despite the Declaration of Independence, there are plenty of people who made the choice to enlist in the Continental Army or in state forces who maybe were regretting that choice and decided they weren't up to the rigors of military service. And it's interesting that some of those accounts, too, come not just from the immediate Boston area, from much further afield across New England.
Yeah. So another thing that is maybe contradictory that's advertised a lot in this newspaper are goods, and a lot of goods coming, goods coming from England.
Yeah.
Fine English goods, English wool, English silk, English pottery.
Maybe not even coming directly from England at this moment, but being marketed as such,
right,
because that's what people want. There are also some introductions of some Dutch and French goods, which is kind of interesting to see the diversification of this marketplace as stuff comes in after we have cut off our ability to access supplies from England. And those still retain a cultural value, but they're going to become harder and harder to get as the war continues.
Yeah. Another very sad but very real thing that's being advertised is the sale of enslaved people.
Absolutely.
Might be surprising for some people to see this in a Boston newspaper right next to the Declaration of Independence, but that's the reality of the time.
Slavery is alive and well in New England as it was across what becomes the United States after the Declaration of Independence. So, the words of this Declaration of Independence still lay on top of a society that very much does not allow the independence, the freedom of many people. And that we see that on the pages of this document right here. As long, on the same token, we see the popular response of what's happening in New York, of what's happening in Boston as the Declaration is read out. And people who have the ability to express their own freedoms do things like tear down the statue of George III in New York, which is mentioned in here, or destroy the emblems of the monarchy that are on public buildings and other structures across Boston, which is pretty interesting.
And that stuff is written about in a pretty inflammatory way. I mean, in the article where they're talking about the tearing down of the statue of King George in Bowling Green in New York City, they write, "The lead wherewith this monument was built will be run into bullets to assimilate with the brains of our adversaries."
Yeah,
that's
belligerent stuff.
Yeah.
And it was done. We know that lead was in part melted down to make bullets for American military forces during the Revolutionary War. The interesting thing about the timing of this is a number of references here, including some of the deserter ads, are for units that are headed north up to Canada, to the Canadian theater of war. And the irony is that by the time that this was published, that army was retreating back up Lake Champlain towards Ticonderoga. The Canadian invasion had collapsed by that point. So even though there are ads published in Chambly or to say, send these deserters if you find them back up to Canada, those troops are long gone from those positions because the situation of the Continental Army has collapsed. And it's even later than the printing of this that we get news of the Declaration of Independence, or really the text of the Declaration of Independence, here at Ticonderoga. News comes kind of later in July. We know that the first reading that's here was on July 28th of 1776, which gives you some sense of how time has to pass in this case.
Really only a few days after this
barely
was
a week after this particular edition. And it's interesting to think that maybe something like this would have headed along the post up to Ticonderoga to be read by soldiers who are reading news that's in some ways already out of date. And the response here at Ticonderoga is both, it's both sides of the coin, really, because there are people that hearing the Declaration of Independence read to the army say, now we're a people, now we have a name in the world. And there's others that say, well, it made a little buzz and was soon forgotten. That's literally what it says in one officer's diary. But it goes to show that there's a variety of reactions to this momentous event. But the reality for the army here at Ticonderoga is one of simply having to survive, to rebuild, because the words that were written in Philadelphia here that were circulated across the country couldn't mean anything unless this army held its ground and was able to make independence a real thing. And in fact, we've got another artifact here that I think reflects this quite nicely. This is an engraved powder horn, one of over 100 that we have in our collection here. And it's made it says the Canada Department, and it's inscribed here in November of 1776, so later in the year, owned by a gentleman named Uziel Hurd. What's interesting about it, though, is the title that we see right on the front here indicates that it was made at Mount Independence, which is right across the lake, Lake Champlain.
So you're standing on the walls of Fort Ticonderoga looking south over the lake, just to the left, to the east, which is present-day Vermont, but in the period would have been part of the greater Ticonderoga area. That's where Mount Independence is.
And of course, the name Mount Independence comes from the fact that we had declared independence in July of 1776.
It's being kind of generous to call it a mountain, but
it's a rise. Mount sounds good. It's better than some of the previous names that were given to this. Diamond Point by the French, or Rattlesnake Hill in some accounts. Mount Independence sounds much better ultimately. And it retains that name. We first really see this popping up at least as early as early August of 1776. So a little after the Declaration is read out to the army. And it's referred to consistently as that for the rest of the Revolutionary War. Even, I should say, by British and German forces that later occupied that position in 1777. They continue to call it Mount Independence or sometimes Mount Independent. So clearly the name stuck. Of course, though, the Declaration of Independence is a hugely significant event, certainly in retrospect, for the world. And it's informed declarations of independence and inspired movements for independence across the country ever since. But nowhere has it been more powerful, I think, than here in the United States. And this thing right here is a bit of evidence of that. This is much later than any of the other objects we have here. But this cane, as it is inscribed on the top here, on this little silver head, was made in the middle of the 19th century, so the mid-1800s. And it says made out of original wood from Independence Hall. Of course, the Declaration of Independence was presented, it was approved by Congress in what we today call Independence Hall. At the time, it was just the Pennsylvania State House, which had been built in the 1730s. And over time, of course, like any number of different buildings, it went through renovations and repairs. There was a series of repairs done in the mid-19th century, and evidently some folks stripped the wood out of that and turned it into this cane or this walking stick, which was
It's a very 19th century thing to
very 19th century thing to do. They love to have this tangible connection to the past through some physical thing that was, stripped out of some building or something like that. And so that's what we have right here is one of these classic kind of 19th century souvenirs that connected that generation back with the Declaration and the period in which it was written. And this becomes ever more popular, especially as we get towards the centennial of American independence in 1876. And you see stuff like this popping up all over the place. Whether or not it may have actually been, a part of the true cross, as it were, is always up for grabs. But it does show the value, I think, that people at the time felt for this physical connection to the momentous events of history.
Yeah.
So all this stuff is going to be on display this year in our Revolutionary Anthology exhibit, where you can come see it, and it'll be up on our online collections database as well.